All right, so a very good morning or good afternoon or good evening because there are people joining virtually from different parts of the world. My name is Surya Dev. I'm a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And we're going to do this panel together with Justine Nolan. Justine, over to you to introduce yourself and then we get going.
Thank you and good morning to everybody. My name is Justine Nolan. I'm based at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and have been working on business and human rights for more than 20 years now. So I'm looking forward to talking to you this morning, but also we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. So we really welcome any comments or questions that you have in the chat as we're going. Don't wait for an opportunity. Please feel free to inject any comments, and we'll also have some time during it where we'll explicitly be asking for your involvement in some questions. Thanks, Surya.
Thank you very much. So the basic objective of this session is to bring to speed the participants who may not fully understand UN guiding principles and the linkages with sustainable development goals. I think that is the key purpose. We fully understand that some of you may already understand these issues, so you may find this session perhaps not needed for you, but our objective was to ensure that everyone is on the same page before we go into the substantive sessions. So Justine and I will take you through some of the key elements of the UN guiding principles and how they are linked with sustainable development goals. And as Justine highlighted, please feel free to put your question in the chat box. The people who are in the room, you can use your mic to ask us questions, or if you have any comments, please do that. We'll also try to do a number of polls, and if time allows, potentially an exercise as well. So let us see how much we can cover in this space. So UN guiding principles were adopted in June 2011. They are the global standards because all the states, businesses, civil society organizations, and almost all the stakeholders accept them as the authoritative standards in the field of business and human rights. They were developed by the person that you see on the slide, Professor John Draghi, after this process of consultation during 2005 to 2011. These principles apply to all businesses, and I think that is a critical component. They apply to formal and informal sector. They apply to small businesses, big businesses operating in any sector. And they also apply to all the governments, and they cover all human rights. And I think that is the quite comprehensive approach that they adopt. Now, we will go through these three pillars one by one shortly, but let me start that what these three pillars are. So there are 31 principles in total. The first pillar is the duty of the state or the governments to protect against human rights abuses by the private sector. The second is the business responsibility to respect human rights, and this is an independent responsibility. And the third element is effective remedy. And here we are looking at the role of both governments as well as businesses and other actors like national human rights institutions. So Justine, if you can take it from here, what is the status of guiding principles and how they're impacting law and policy in different parts of the world?
So before we got to the guiding principles in 2011, there was a whole history of sort of a slow evolving development around corporate social responsibility, business and human rights, sustainability, using lots of different terms. And most of what had been developed to date are what we call soft law, where it's guidelines or codes. So they're not legally binding in the sense that they're like domestic law or an international treaty. And sometimes people look to the UN guiding principles and say, well, what is their value? They're not law, they're not hard law, they're not legally binding, so states are not bound by them. But in this field in particular, what we're seeing is that there's this real mix between sort of voluntary and mandatory. And as we get to see in a moment, there's more and more laws that are starting to be introduced that deal with the interaction between business and human rights. But the fact that the guiding principles are not legally binding by themselves doesn't make them deficient. Basically they build on and are based on binding norms. They're consistent with international treaties on human rights, and they could become strengthened and stronger, particularly by virtue of domestic legislation and perhaps something like the UN Business and Human Rights Treaty, which is being discussed. So here you can see the influence and really the quite rapid uptake in some domestic initiatives that have been developed in the last 4, 5, or 6 years around the role of business with human rights. Some of them are regional, like the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and the EU at the moment is actually, you can see there right at the bottom, has just kicked off discussions on developing mandatory human rights due diligence regulation throughout the EU, which would be a really massive step forward, and human rights due diligence we'll come to later as part of the UN Guiding Principles. But here you can also see some real specific domestic laws that deal with the interaction of business and human rights. The UK Modern Slavery Act, dealing specifically with the role of businesses that are operating in the UK to report on the risks of modern slavery. That act was brought in 2015, and Australia brought another act in 2018, which was sort of a similar version to the UK, but slightly stronger in several aspects. Then we'll also see that there's the Chinese due diligence guidelines for responsible mineral supply chains that have been in operation since 2015. And then some laws that have gone further than just reporting, most notably the French duty of vigilance law, which in essence is basically mandating a type of due diligence that companies must do along with reporting. And that law has sort of more recently gone into operation and is being tested in the courts right now. The Indonesian ministerial regulation on fishing from 2017. India has developed national guidelines on responsible business conduct, and the Dutch Child Labour Due Diligence Act, which is not yet in effect, but will likely come in effect in 2021, 2022, which is similar to the French law. So these laws have been basically building on and developed from the framework that the UN Guiding Principles set out. And on this chart, you can't see all the names on it, but if you look at it and the various quadrants in this, these are all the types of developments that have really happened in the last 10 years in the business and human rights field. And if you were developing this chart 10 years ago, it really would have just very few dots. So this is a mix of, in the bottom left-hand side, the light blue dots, you can see there countries that have developed national action plans. In the bottom right, guidelines and soft law and multi-stakeholder initiatives that have often been developed between civil society, companies, and sometimes governments. In the top right, more institutional level guidance from the UN, the ILO, the OECD, which again is all sort of building on the soft law framework, giving companies guidance on what responsible business conduct looks like. And then on the top left-hand side, the red dots, these are the laws that have started to come in play really just in the last 5 or 6 years, which is quite fast in this field. So we're seeing a really rapid development and recognition of the role that business has to play with human rights. Sometimes this is through a soft law framework like the UN Guiding Principles, and it's also now being mandated in some countries through reporting and due diligence requirements.
Thanks, Justine. And in the same year, in 2011, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights was also established. These are the 5 experts, and I'm one of those experts. I represent Asia Pacific, and it's really great pleasure that this forum is taking place in this regional setting. You must have heard from my colleague, Anita Ramasastry, who is the current chair, a couple of minutes back. So I think our mandate is to disseminate and implement the UN Guiding Principles all over the world, and we are adopting a regional or sub-regional approach. We are raising awareness, building capacity, and working with governments, businesses, civil society actors, and everyone else basically to promote the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles in different ways, including developing nation action plans on business and human rights. So we will talk about that a little bit more later in the forum. In particular, there will be a session tomorrow that I'll be moderating. But let us move on to the Pillar 1 now. And this Pillar 1 has 10 principles, and these principles are directed at states. We will not be covering all these elements, but we would like to focus on some of these elements. So let me start with principles 1 and 2. And principle 1 is talking about basically a broad duty. It's an overarching principle that states need to do a number of steps to ensure that businesses respect human rights. And if they are not able to respect human rights, there are some abuses, then the governments have a duty to investigate and punish, and of course, provide remedies in those particular situations. So I think these are important elements. Now, what I would like to stress here is that this duty is not limited to the territory of the states. Of course, they have this duty within their own territory, but I think it is also quite critical that they also have to take these steps outside their territory as well if they have the jurisdiction. And I think this element is quite relevant because Principle 2 expects that businesses respect human rights throughout their operations as well. And if they have to respect human rights throughout their operations, then the governments have to set out these expectations. And I think that provides us a good time to do the question that we would like to do now. Uh, so I hope people in the room can see the question on their screen, and the online participants can see this poll question, and we would very much like you to participate. And people in the room, can you use your mic if you have any questions to us, and others can put their questions or any comments in the chat box. And we have 18 people out of 30 already voting. Uh,
And if you are in the room, you can also log on to the website on the schedule platform, because we'll do a couple more polls during this session. So if you click on the schedule platform where the agenda is on this session, you can also do the polls from there if you would like to.
That is an excellent point. So I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds. So if anyone would like to vote in, please put in your vote about this question, and hopefully we will share the result very shortly. So Justine, I'm going to end the poll now and share the result. And the result is there. So the question was, should states regulate the overseas conduct of their companies? And I'm quite surprised with the result, because overwhelmingly 96% of the participants are saying that the state should regulate. And I'm saying I'm so surprised because in the field of business and human rights, there is a heated debate going on that whether there should be extraterritorial obligations or not. And many scholars and many governments question that they have these obligations. But I think in terms of the participants here, I think they definitely expect the governments to act. And what does this really mean? It basically means that, let us say we have an Australian company operating in Fiji or in PNG, then we expect the Australian government to ensure that not only the Australian companies are operating within Australia, but also if they're operating in Fiji, in PNG, in Solomon Island, or anywhere else in the world, they should be regulated by businesses. Justine, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think what's interesting that if when Surya and I started working in this field, this question would not have been answered in such an overwhelming manner, such as this, because the original debate was around whether there should be any regulation at all. And what I think we've seen in the last 10 years is a greater acceptance of the need to have some type of regulation, whether it's soft or hard. And the debate has become much more seriously about what that looks like. But when this field sort of, first started to become much more mainstream, the first question was if they should be regulated at all. And overwhelmingly, people felt like, no, they shouldn't. So I think we have seen a real shift in mindset. There are lots of questions, as Surya said, around particularly overseas conduct and whether that is the right way to go. But there has been started a lot more serious discussion about the how. And I think that's a real advancement in this movement. And we'll be sort of trying to touch on a little bit of that today.
Thank you. One element that the UN Guiding Principles highlight is the spatial role that state-owned enterprises have in the context of promoting business respect for human rights. And Principle 4 is very clear on this, that the government should take additional steps to ensure that is state-owned enterprises. And here the ownership could be in terms of the shares. It could also be the control in terms of the appointing directors in the board. There could also be situations of public-private partnerships. And I think I put some logos here from Fiji and PNG just to give you a sense that what kind of companies are we talking about here. Of course, all businesses have to respect human rights, but when it comes to those companies which have some kind of a nexus with the government, then the expectations are higher. And we expect in those particular situations that they will lead from the front, they will lead by the example, and a working group has provided some guidance on that. So I'll invite you to read that report. If you have the time, you see the reference here on this slide. Then let us move on to principle 5, Justine.
So this is an interesting one to think about, because are there certain activities where the involvement of companies takes on sort of additional or a stricter type of scrutiny in relation to its impact on human rights? And so if you think about the outsourcing or privatizing of some really basic services, such as access to water, sometimes access to healthcare, access to sanitation, electricity. These are common things that are often outsourced to the private sector, but they are very fundamental, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights. And so in this case, Principle 5 of the UN Guiding Principles is very clear that the states should have some involvement in here, ensure that there's adequate oversight so that any outsourcing is done in a way that is consistent with human rights principles and people have access, still have access to those particular rights.
All right, and I think I also saw a comment from Holly in the chat box that I think there is a growing recognition in terms of regulation that needs to happen, but I think there could be some still disagreement about what this regulation should entail. Should there be penalties and all that? And I think that also became quite clear in the Swiss vote a couple of days back on Sunday, right? So there was a vote that should there be a kind of mandatory due diligence and penalties for Swiss companies. And I think overall percentage, just over 50% people said yes, though the proposal could not get through, Justine, as you know. But I think there is definitely a growing appetite in terms of all over the world that the states have to step in. And I think in that particular context, the policy coherence under Principle 8 becomes quite relevant, because there are a number of government departments and ministries, and business and human rights is a broad landscape. It covers almost each and every ministry and department. So when the governments are drafting their policies in the field of attracting investment, climate change, environment, labor rights, informal economy, women and child welfare, whatever it is, I think it is absolutely critical that they're moving in a cohesive manner. And I think this cohesiveness is also needed in a federal country. If you are a federal country, at the central government and this provincial government, this cohesiveness is also needed when states are negotiating at the international level as part of WTO, as part of World Bank, IMF, and all these. So to ensure that whatever they're doing at the domestic level in implementing the UN guiding principles are also taken into account at the international level. Justine, if you want to take
And
this.
there's a comment in the chat from Howard, which is sort of right on this point, where he says, we would not want multinational companies exploiting weaker legislation in developing countries. And so that's this idea that we have these, and the UN, what the UN Guiding Principles is trying to do is set a global framework, which is sort of the minimum standard that is applied everywhere. So just by a Australian or a Chinese company operating in a different region, that all of a sudden they can't then exploit loopholes in local laws. And so that's what is also relevant with Principle 9, trying to have some coherence around trade and investment agreements so that they're consistent with basic human rights obligations. So then we move on to the second pillar of the guiding principles. So that first pillar we were looking at
Justine, before, do you want to briefly
yep.
say about Principle 9?
Yep.
Or should I do that?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so Principle 9, and there's a question in the chat box as well. I will react to that question from Julie as well. So Principle 9 is about trade and investment agreements. The expectation, and this is kind of an extension of the policy coherence in Principle 8, that we're talking about that all the trade agreements that states have negotiated in the past or in the future, they should be compatible with the international human rights obligations of the governments. Now, how do you achieve it? I mean, going forward, of course, there's plenty of guidance, but if you have already negotiated some trade or investment agreements, that I think is absolutely critical that the governments have to think of ways how to refine this. And UNCTAD has provided some guidance on that. And I think the working group is going to write a report next year on 2011 on how to draft human rights compatible investment agreements. And I think your question, Julie, about that what is the effect of free trade agreements, I think this is absolutely critical. Because sometimes what is happening is that the governments are focusing on trade, and then they tend to forget about human rights at that particular point of time. I think the recent agreement that has been concluded in this part of the world is a good example of it. If you look at the regional economic, I think it's called recap, this agreement does not really talk about human rights. And I think that is problematic, because whenever you are negotiating any trade or investment agreement, you need to consider the human rights dimensions of those agreements. Otherwise, we are going to put the human rights on the back burner, and the society will not benefit equally. And I think that is something we should be avoiding, and that is what the UN guiding principles are expecting us to do. So let us now move on to pillar 2. Justine, over to you.
Yeah, so the first pillar, as we mentioned, we've been talking about, was all around the state duty to protect. And that is really building on state obligations that they've already got in relation to international human rights law. So the responsibility of business is set out in pillar 2. And you can see here that it notes that all business enterprises have a responsibility to respect all internationally recognized human rights. So as Surya said at the outset, this is all business. So it's small, medium-sized, large business, no matter where you are located in the world. And it's all human right, all internationally recognized human rights. So it's not just picking out, these are the most important rights. It's trying to take a fairly comprehensive approach to ensuring greater respect for human rights from business. And it's important for business to understand that this is both sort of an independent responsibility, but it's also one that's complementary to state. So even where you might be operating in an area where people might argue that state is failing in its duty to protect human rights, that then doesn't abdicate business from a responsibility to respect human rights. It has this independent responsibility no matter where it's operating. So what does it look like? In a nutshell, it basically means that business should avoid infringing on rights. So this basic rule of do no harm to others. And they must also work to address adverse human rights impacts. So this sort of term that's used within the UN guiding principles is adverse human rights impacts. The idea where business has operated in a way where harm has actually occurred. So then how do they work to fix this? How do they address it? And then we'll get into the question later on of how they might be dealing with remedy. And so when we talk about business-related human rights impacts, the UN guiding principles, in particular in Principle 13, discusses 3 ways that this might come into effect. And they are that business might cause, contribute, or be directly linked to adverse human rights impacts. And Surya, do you want to go on to the next one and discuss this a little bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this typology is quite relevant because the nature of responsibility varies slightly based on this typology. And causing is, of course, most serious. And I think this involves a situation when a company is directly causing that harm. So let us say there is a factory and the pollutants from that factory are going to the river directly. So then here the company is causing the environmental pollution. Or you have a company that discriminates against women. They pay less to women. Or you have a situation in which there could be discrimination against people of certain race or religion, you know. So these are typical examples in which the companies are causing serious violations of human rights. And if that is the case, the guiding principles expect those companies to cease those actions. And sometimes it could be also an omission. And of course, if the violations have already taken place, they should also provide for or cooperate in remediation. So I think it's both about fixing what you have done wrong in the past, but it also addressing going forward that you don't do those particular situations in future. So probably Justine, you can take the contribution element, the second.
Yeah, so there's sort of a little bit of a gray area between contributed to and directly linked to. But the idea is that, again, contributed to is this stronger connection that a company has. And that responsibility then means to stop that action and use the leverage that you might have in order to work on remediation and find a solution to that problem. So if you think of an example in a supply chain where a company at the top of that supply chain is operating in a way and dictating a business model and pricing that basically will lead to abuse at the bottom of that supply chain, and may very much lead to workers being underpaid or being involved in forced labor or in bad conditions, then even though that company at the top of the supply chain is not directly causing that issue, they're still contributing to that problem and may then have a role in relation to remediation. So when companies are causing or contributing to a problem, there's this clear responsibility to be involved in remediating the issue. The third category is when companies are what's called directly linked to the adverse human rights impact or the human rights abuse that's going on. And they're the responsibility, they may well still be involved in remediation, but basically their responsibility in the guiding principles is to use or build that leverage to mitigate the risk. So an example here might be a financial institution that is providing funds to a company to perhaps do an expansion or build a dam or build a, to basically finance logging. And it might be that that financial investment firm is several layers removed from the harm that is occurring on the ground, where people are forcibly displaced in order for that development to go ahead. But that financial investment firm may either be directly linked or even contributing to the problem. So it may be in one of those layers, and that will then dictate the responsibility that they have.
Thanks, Justine. So then the question is that what should businesses do when they face these situations? And under Pillar 2 of the UN Guiding Principles, every business, it does not matter what kind of a company you are, every business is expected to do three broad things. First, they should make a policy commitment to respect human rights, and this commitment should be made at the highest possible level. I think some guidance is provided by Principle 16 on this in detail. The second is they should do human rights due diligence, and we will try to explain what this means, what are the 4 steps of this. And the third is that they should have some kind of a system in place to provide remediation. So of course, the states have a critical role in providing remediation and holding businesses accountable, but the UN Guiding Principles also expect businesses to establish some kind of an operational level grievance mechanism where they can redress those grievances at the early stage. So human rights due diligence is very critical, and we will explain that. But before we do that, I think it could be a good time to ask questions. So probably we explain it first. Briefly, what this means, there's a 4-step process, and this is an ongoing process. So we start with assessing an impact. So that is the starting point. So a business should try to find out how it is positively or negatively impacting the society, how it is impacting people around us. And these could be employees, these could be members in the community, these could be consumers. So I think they have to find out how they are impacting adversely. And once they find out this, now the adverse impact could be that they may find that they have child labor issues in their supply chains. It could be that there is gender discrimination, or there are not enough women in the leadership positions in factories. Or the assessment could be that they are not treating the trade union leaders very well, or they could be situations about environmental pollution. Whatever they find, they have to integrate those impact assessments into their action plan, basically what they can do to fix those challenges that they have identified. Now let us say if they find that we are not really having a plan to address climate change, or we have too much plastic waste on the beaches. Someone was saying in the plenary session, how could businesses work to eliminate the plastic from the beaches, right? So that is something they need to consider. They need to track their responses because not everything can be fixed overnight or in a week time or in a couple of months. So they may need to track it. How much progress we can make in the next 2 months, how much progress we can make next year, and how much we can achieve in the next 5 years. So I think that would help. And finally, they need to communicate their responses to the stakeholders. People should know what businesses have done, what they plan to do in future, what is perfect, what is imperfect, what is the work in progress. So I think that is a dynamic process. We will, if time allows, we will go into each of these 4 steps a little bit more. But I think there could be this time for the second poll question that I would like to launch. And so the question is before you now. So I will invite the online participants as well as people in the room. You can log in to uh, the survey by clicking on the link, or you can also use microphone. I don't know if Robert is in the room somewhere there. We would definitely like to get some questions from the room. So Robert, you can ask who is interested to ask any questions to us, and that person can speak in the microphone. Uh, and we are looking at now the poll as well. So I think we have 23 people already voting, and perhaps let us see. I'm going to share the result in a couple of minutes. Robert, I can see you. Thank you very much, and you're looking very nice, very handsome. Thank you. And thank you for organizing. Robert is, by the way, the person behind this, working in Suva with her team, including Hyun, who you may see online. So I'm going to close the poll now and share the result with all of you. I'm ending the poll. We got 30 people voting, and the result is shared. And I think, again, the overwhelming people are saying that businesses should conduct human rights due diligence regularly. And I think that is also in line with UN guiding principles. That may show that you already understand UN guiding principles, perhaps. A couple of people have mentioned that it should be done 2 or 3 times. But I think the idea is that it is an ongoing process. And I think it's very critical that businesses understand this. Robert, I just wonder if there are any questions in the room that they would like to ask based on what we have said, or anything that people would like to ask about the UN guiding principles and what governments and businesses need to do. Before we proceed further, I think it would be good to hear.
I think the room is just muted. We need to unmute the room.
I think microphone may be working, but I...
Okay, now it should work. Go ahead, please.
Work? Okay.
Okay, I'll do that again. My name's Ashwin Gibson-Blake. I'm from the Right Image Company. We've spent the last 3 decades almost researching and pioneering how to build people companies and people nations. So very interested in what's happening today. I have a question when it comes to United Nations organizations in the Pacific. How much due diligence has been conducted in the United Nations operations? And if there were incidents where human rights were being infracted upon, would it not be obvious that it would come forward in the form of an event or issues that are reported? And so what would the process line and how are the principles actually applied?
Thank you. That is an excellent question. I think when we talk about human rights due diligence, I think the starting point is raising awareness, because we felt that the awareness amongst businesses, I mean, it's great that you are doing this business, which is people oriented. And I think this, to me, looks like the social enterprise model of business, where you're working not just to make profit, but promoting a more holistic vision of business in society. But I think there are all different kinds of businesses, and I think many of them are not fully aware of the impact or the adverse impact of them on society. Even the UN agencies sometimes are doing due diligence, sometimes perhaps they're not very good at doing it. So I think the roadmap is very patchy at this particular point of time, especially in the Pacific. More needs to be done, and I hope the events like this can create that kind of a common platform where people can come together in a room and discuss and construct some collective and collaborative solutions. Justine, probably you could also add something if you want to.
Sure. I mean, it raises a good question, because a lot of the focus of the UN Guiding Principles is on business and their responsibilities around human rights. But business also looks to say, well, what is government doing? What is the UN doing? What are large institutions doing around this? Some governments are leading, but many governments are lagging. And many large institutions like the United Nations also have a very long way to go in terms of looking at their own impact and the due diligence that is required for the operations they conduct. We've started to see a greater sort of examination of UN activities in the last few years, particularly around peacekeeping operations and other operations the UN is conducting. But as you, I think, probably imply, there is still a long way to go with both governments and large institutions, along with bringing business along. Robert, were there any other questions before we went on any further?
Vinaka, my name is Mereoni Tanginandabui. I would like to ask if there ministries, the government ministries are also in this workshop, from the Ministry of Women or from youth and sports, because I believe that these are the machineries that initiate policies in regards to what I would like to ask is about families and women. When I talk about families, young children are sent out into the streets, talking about small business, to sell their produce. Are there policies in place that protects these children, or are they allowed to be out on the streets selling whatever they are selling, whether it's banana cake or whether it's roti or whatever it may be? And for women, we still see women who comes from the villages to sell their farm produce. They still sleeping on market floors. Are there policies in place? Has the ministry done things to protect these women? And again, this question goes to the state. So are these government ministries represented in this kind of workshop? Because we need to know whether there are policies in place to protect kids and also to protect women.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, I would say. I'm not sure if there is someone from that ministry already in the room or joining us virtually, but we did invite the government ministries, and we know that some representatives of different ministries are there. But what I can assure you is that this forum is merely a starting point, and we will do some more workshops targeting different ministries together. We'll bring only ministries together, let us say, in a room, and those issues are fundamental about the policy coherence. These ministries should work together and see how they can work together, develop policies, create incentives, and create a regulatory framework to protect women, children, and in fact, everyone in society.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions in the chat box as well. So there is a question from Howard that what is the role of trade unions in keeping, in ensuring that companies respect human rights? And I think it's an absolutely critical role, trade unions. And I think the freedom of association and collective bargaining are absolutely vital, especially in the context of supply chains. I think, Justine, you have done a lot of work in relation to supply chains. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have time today to go into all the elements of the human rights due diligence, but the idea one is very much that human rights due diligence is consultative. So if a company is just doing due diligence and not speaking to people outside that company, then that's really not a holistic or sufficient framework within to do it. So they must draw on independent experts, but particularly civil society and trade unions. So there's this sort of notion that you can see there that there is meaningful consultation, because companies are generally not experts in human rights. So they should be seeking to expand that and bring people in who know more about that. And that's very much the goal of human rights due diligence. And the same would be if companies are involved or government is involved in designing remedies, which is the third pillar of business and human rights. Again, that should be something that is done with consultation. So the idea that remedies are accessible and open to all means that in designing a framework for remedy, you would want to involve unions and civil society experts in that process. There was another question in the chat just before we get back, was around the development of a business and human rights treaty. Because I said at the start that a lot of the guidelines in this area are what we call soft laws, so they're not legally binding. There is a discussion underway at the United Nations since 2014. There's a expert group working on the development of a treaty. And so far we've seen 3 drafts of what that treaty might look like. And that treaty you can find online, the draft treaty, which is being developed by governments, but also with consultation from civil society and business and industry groups, etc. But there's very much it's somewhat a slow process to develop international law. And there's not universal agreement at all from governments around the value of a business and human rights treaty. So though I think what we're seeing with more countries starting to accept the notion that there should be mandatory human rights due diligence, we are seeing somewhat of a shift, particularly in the EU, around the notion that perhaps maybe a treaty would not be such a fast step from that. So it's something that's in process, but at the moment, and maybe quite some time before it's developed, but at the moment there isn't a specific business and human rights treaty.
Thanks, Justine. And I think there's also a question from Commissioner Sumoyo from New Zealand that any examples of countries that have integrated UN guiding principles into trade agreements to date. And I would mention a couple of concrete examples here, not expressly referring to UN guiding principles, but the European Union trade agreement with Cambodia or Vietnam in recent times. They expressly talk about labor rights issues and improving the collective bargaining standards in the countries. I think that is a step in the right direction. We also have the Dutch government issuing a model investment agreement that expressly includes UN guiding principles, that businesses or investors should respect UN guiding principles. We also have the Canadian trade agreements, which are trying to promote gender equality as well as labor rights issues. So we are moving in this particular direction slowly, but definitely surely. So let us, Robert, are there any further questions, or should we move further in terms of subsequent slides?
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, one more question.
Let us take that question. Thank you very much, Robert, for your help.
Thank you, Professor Surya. This is Natasha Khan from USP. Really interesting, you mentioned some of the governments who've been doing that using guiding principles, but is there any particular, I know I recently, I think, read a report with the Porgera mine in PNG have starting to implement some of the issues around it. Is there any other company that we know in the Pacific is doing that? Because it's something quite abstract for many of us, I think, to understand why businesses would want to engage in that and sort of some of the reasons behind the businesses who are starting to engage using guiding principles.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and good to see you in the room. Excellent. We cannot meet each other in person, but we are able to connect virtually. I think you're right that Barrick Gold commissioned a number of reports, and in some of these reports, they were made recommendations, specific recommendations based on UN guiding principles. Now, the community is not fully satisfied with what Barrick Gold has done, but I think it could be said that the company is trying to implement UN guiding principles, even if it is imperfect. And I think that is one example of it. There are other companies from Australia, for instance, which are operating in the Pacific, and they are trying to integrate those considerations into their operations. So I think there is a patchwork in terms of how many companies are doing it, but I think over these 2 days, I hope in different sessions there will be some evidence and sharing from different stakeholders what different companies are doing.
Shall we?
I'm
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm Surajmati Nand from Pacific Dialogue, board member. According to her, if there is any provision by the government for the women in the market vendors, Suva market has some accommodations and people are sharing overnight, sometimes in the weekends. The government has also made accommodation at Rikiriki market, and I think they will be proceeding in other places as well.
Thank you very much for that comment and a response. It's really good that somehow the technology is working and we are able to bring the virtual and the physical rooms together. That is excellent. And I think I must thank once again the Office of the High Commissioner team in Suva in pulling all this together. This looks easy, but it is not easy. So thank you very much. Let us now proceed further, and feel free to ask Robert any questions, and he can give you the microphone, or of course, the virtual people put your question in the chat box. We will try our best to address them. But Justine, let us move forward and try to cover some other elements.
Well, we have talked a little bit about human rights due diligence, so I won't dwell on it too much now. But we talked about, the role that you have to do. But here's the summary, that it's very much human rights due diligence is about looking outward. So it's the risk the company poses to others, not the risk to the company. And that's a very important mind shift for companies to think about. And it may be, to categorize their activity around whether they're causing or contributing to a problem, or they're linked to that relationship and the responsibility that flows from that. And this point that you sort of all really noted in the poll that we did earlier, that human rights due diligence is very much an ongoing process. It's not a once-off thing and then you've satisfied your duty in relation to that. You have to do it because circumstances change. So you should be discussing actual problems, the potential for problems, and it should be an ongoing process. And it will be very much driven by the context of the operations, the size of the company, the sector that you're operating in. All of these will impact the type of human rights due diligence that will be done. But it's fair to say that at the moment, what we're seeing is that it's insufficient often by companies, and there needs to be a more substantive involvement around it, with the goal that what companies are really trying to do is work for the benefit of a community and bring the community along with what they're doing, rather than sort of some operation which is imposed to the detriment of the community. It's responding, a company that basically does human rights due diligence is making much more a sincere effort to respond to stakeholders. Over time, it's creating greater value for the company and the community with which is operating, and very much building towards a more sustainable method of operation with what we want to see with it. So the final pillar, which we'll just talk about briefly so we can get on just to talk about the SDGs also, is pillar 3, which is that both companies and governments have a responsibility in relation to the provision of remedy. And it's clear that this remedy in particular, this third pillar, is perhaps the most underdeveloped and the one that is lacking implementation in this field most at the moment. And you can see here the UN guiding principles contemplate 3 broad types of mechanisms. They might be state-based judicial mechanisms, and these might be things like court systems, so you're being able to litigate, being able to hold someone liable. State-based non-judicial grievance mechanisms. And again, there are a number of examples of this, but it might be through administrative mechanisms. Sometimes it might be through a national human rights institution that develops a mechanism. And there's also non-state-based grievance mechanisms. These are quite broad. It might involve things like operational grievance mechanisms that are perhaps more industry-led. It might be looking at something like the OECD, which provides a remedy through the national contact point. So there are all different types of ways that you can look at this. And the UN Working Group has written a really short and accessible report on remedy, which I encourage you to have a look at. Here's the link here. But Surya, I'll hand over to you, given you wrote the report, to just talk about this bit.
Thank you. I mean, one key element is that what makes remedies effective. And I think, of course, the process should be effective, but I think we emphasized in this report that the outcome should also be effective. And I think there are a number of elements. I think the starting point is the rights holders should be very central, but rights holders are not a homogeneous group. There are men and women, there are children, there are people with physical disability, there are migrant workers, there are people with different sexual orientation, there are indigenous communities, there are people of different race and religion who speak different languages. So I think both the governments as well as businesses, they have to understand that when they talk about the impact on rights holders, they are sensitive to these diversities and differences. It is also critical that a gender lens is adopted. That is the second report that I wrote last year. And we will be sharing these PowerPoints as well as the links to all these documents. So all of you would have easy access to this material for your future work. And I think the key is that the impact on women could be different from the impact on men. And I think that is where the issue of gender responsive human rights due diligence, because if a company is talking to the community members, if they don't listen to women members of the community, then they are not going to get a true picture. I think this is absolutely vital that this is gender responsive. Then, of course, remedies should be accessible and affordable, timely and adequate. These are self-explanatory terms. I will not spend too much on this, but I would like to underline this element of victimization. What we have seen that in all over the world, all across the world, if someone tries to seek remedies, then they may face intimidation. If you are working in a company, you may be fired. If you are a trade union leader, you may be dismissed. If you are trying to mobilize a protest, you could be arrested by police, So we see this kind of victimization, and I think we are encouraging the governments as well as businesses to understand that the civil society organizations and human rights defenders, they have a key role to play. They should work in partnership. So these are critical friends. You should work together with them rather than consider them as your adversary and try to target them in those particular situations. The last element that I would like to highlight is this concept of bouquet of remedies. What this basically means is that when we talk about remedies, we are not merely looking at compensation. We are looking at rather a number of things together, because a community would like to hear a sincere apology from a company if there are abuses in the past, that we made a mistake, we are sorry, we will not repeat it. So the guarantee of non-repetition is equally relevant. Then there has to be accountability of the corporate officials. If the government officials are involved, they have to be held accountable as well. So those are the elements that make it an effective remedy together. So it's not one element, but everything together. So let us now move on to the final element of our presentation, that is about sustainable development goals and how they link with UN guiding principles. Justine, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I mean, you would all be familiar with and heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. And when you look at these 17 goals that are set up there, they seem very broad and amorphous in many ways. But if you have a look go online and have a look at the SDGs, you can see that they get way more specific as they go along. And these are very much sort of broad aspirational ideas. And what has proven sort of as we've gone along this route is that it can't be business alone that gets us to achieving these SDGs. We must set concrete goals, and business has to be a partner in doing that. So some of the SDGs then have really direct coherence to what we've been talking about with the UN guiding principles, in particular talking about the relevance to labor rights and remedy, the idea of stopping forced labor, the idea of building in paying a living wage, building in a sustainable development. Here, an example that you have that companies are broadly expected to respect economic, social, and cultural rights. And a way of doing this is to pay a living wage to workers. That then has this direct relationship with the SDGs that you can see on the screen. One, to reduce poverty. Two, that there be zero hunger. And three, a reduction in inequality. So if workers are paid a living wage, that directly impacts their ability to access and fulfill those SDGs. And there is this clear relationship between, that's probably underplayed in some ways, between the UN Guiding Principles, the role of business, and the achievement of SDGs, with the goal being, that we're getting there by 2030 with it. Another example, Surya, do you want to talk about this one in relation to equality and non-discrimination?
Yes. So we have SDG 5 about gender equality. Now the question is, how do we connect it with UN Guiding Principles? And of course, as part of respecting human rights, businesses are not expected to discriminate. So this responsibility not to discriminate, the responsibility to treat everyone equally and without any differentiation based on sex or sexual orientation, is likely to contribute towards SDG 5, because then it is going to reduce the gender pay gap, for instance. It is going to address the issues of underrepresentation of women in the boards, in the manager positions in the factories. It will definitely reduce gender-based violence, because we have to eliminate all kinds of discrimination against anyone. So whether these are discrimination faced by women, or these are discrimination faced by people of a different sexual orientation. And I think that is the nexus between respecting human rights under the UN Guiding Principles, and that in itself will contribute to achieving gender equality. And in fact, we designed kind of a poll question as well. Probably we can do a quick poll, Justine, and then we continue with our, this is the last poll question, by the way. So the question is with you. So people in the room should be able to see it on the screen as well. And if you can, of course, participate by online as well. And then the question is about what is the nexus between UN Guiding Principles and Sustainable Development Goals. So if you can participate, you have about 30 more seconds. I already see about 8-9 people voting.
And while we're waiting for the results of that poll as it's coming in, there's a question on the chat that says, what are the mechanisms to ensure transparency and accountability of due diligence? And this is really excellent and insightful question, because that's really where, at the moment, there is, I would say, still somewhat of a vacuum around that. We've got to the point where new laws are being developed to build greater disclosure in, to have greater transparency. There's also a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives which are building on transparency, but accountability for both the transparency and due diligence is very limited, both in law and soft law at the moment. Something like the French Act and the Dutch Act are trying to build in aspects where if it's not conducted, then the companies would be liable for that in relation to remedies. But most of the laws, if you look at the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Modern Slavery Act, there is no accountability for that at the moment. So that's very much the next step that needs to be developed in this field to ensure greater accountability, that not only are companies just about reporting, but they're about doing, and that they are then held to account for not doing those acts. And I think we'll see that those discussions develop, particularly in next year with the EU discussing mandatory human rights due diligence. So now we have the end of the poll, and we've got really our first time where there's more mixed responses in relation to whether basically is there an equivalence if business is contributing to the SDGs, are they automatically complying with the UNGPs? 14% say yes, 33% say no, and 52% say in some cases. What's your opinion, Surya?
Okay, so that's a very interesting poll, as you mentioned, in terms of the result. I think in some cases that may happen. I agree with that, and I think I would like to bring in here the recommendations of the working group on this. There's a link on this PowerPoint. So we have made 10 recommendations, and I think the basic recommendation that we have is that the starting point for both governments and businesses should be to respect all human rights of everyone. And if they adopt a human rights-based approach, then that is going to result in meeting many of the SDGs. On the other hand, if businesses or the governments do not adopt a human rights-based approach and they cherry pick certain SDGs, so let us say we have a business which picks up on one SDG and contributes towards it. So let us say the SDG it is focusing on is gender equality. But then that company may ignore issues about child labor in the supply chains. That company may ignore issues about climate change. So gender equality is a good goal, and I think you should promote that, but you cannot ignore other elements. So I think the starting point is respecting all human rights. And if you want to go beyond that and focus more on certain SDGs, that is fine. I think that is in crux the recommendation. And I think that is what I would like to highlight. We gave a couple of examples how this connection could be built. One more example, probably this is for you, Justine, because you have a lot of work in this field.
Yeah, we might show this last example and then check back in the room with Robert for any questions as we're coming to the end of this session before lunchtime. So example 3 is that we know that in the UNGPs that companies are expected to respect all labor rights and that they should eliminate worse forms of labor exploitation, which includes child enforced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. And that directly links to SDG 8, which is talking about decent work and economic growth. And SDG 8 also, if you go down and have a look at the various parts of it, for example, 8.7 specifically starts to talk more about modern slavery and the elimination of forced labor and trafficking. And these are probably 3 of the issues which have gained the fastest sort of development just in the last couple of years in terms of the greater regulation of these types of issues. So there has been a push to tackle forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. And we're seeing this mechanism of using greater transparency and disclosure to do that, which is useful, but I would argue not sufficient, partly because it gets us half the way there. But what many of these laws are requiring is actually companies to report, but not necessarily tackle the root of the problem. So what we want to see is that these notions of social disclosures are coupled with human rights due diligence, and then also coupled with a way of, if it's not being done, to build greater corporate accountability around that. But these are examples where governments and companies and civil society have very much worked together to develop both new multi-stakeholder initiatives and laws to try and tackle these 3 really difficult issues. So we're not there, but we have come a long way in the last 5 or 6 years in this area. So perhaps we might just check into the room before we give the last example, because I think we've only got a few more minutes of this session. So Robert, are there any more questions in the room? And there's also some questions on the chat we can chat with as well.
Any final questions from the room? Show hands up. There we are. Yes. Thank you.
And in the meantime, we get the question. I would also like to mention that in the subsequent sessions after lunch today and the whole day tomorrow, there will be different dedicated sessions focusing on different issues. So I would like to encourage you to participate in those sessions and contribute to those sessions actively. And this forum is the starting point. We want to work with all of you to push the agenda in the Pacific region. Thank you. Madam, you have the floor now.
Vinaka, would we be given some write-ups on what's been presented here this morning? It would be really great, Mr.
Sure.
Deva and Ms. Nolan.
Sure.
Rather than just hearing, it would be great to have write-ups.
There will also be recordings of every session, and once we've recorded the sessions, we'll be posting on the web link so that you can watch the sessions back and see what's been discussed.
Perfect. Vinaka.
And you will also have access to these slides and the links that we've, if you would like to look at it in your own time. There is one, there's a couple of great, just before we check, Robert, another question, there's some good comments on the chat as well. Holly raises very much this point around decent work being a holistic concept, which is very true. The notion that Surya was talking about at the start, that you can't just tackle one issue. You can't just tackle gender equality to the exclusion of child labor or the exclusion of wages, that the idea of a decent work is that you are tackling these things in concert. And there's another comment also, which I think is interesting, around the role of business and whether, from Justine, around whether this sort of concept of the SDGs endorsing business as partners is troublesome. and perhaps has been backfired in recent years, because there will always be and always has been examples of corporate irresponsibility, along with the idea where business are doing the right thing. But I think it's a difficult one to basically say in which case just stop using business as a partner, because many of the achievement of the SDGs will not be done by government alone. But I think you are right at times to look at with caution the context within which business is operating on. Some concepts like shared value are better in theory and on paper than in practice. And so you have to figure out, how do we work with business as a substantive partner, not in a tick the box approach where they look like they're being involved or throwing money at the problem. So I think business has an essential role to play, but as a really substantive partner, not just a superficial one. Robert, is there any other questions from the floor?
And in the meantime, there's a question in the chat box from Nandita Das, I think. The question is, how do we understand business and workers? Under the UN guiding principles, businesses include in a very holistic and inclusive manner, which basically means every business activity, whether it is done by family, one person, formal, informal, small, big, everyone is included. And when we talk about the impact on rights holders, then again, it's very inclusive. So gig economy workers, any worker in any broad sense, and ILO has this concept of the world of work, So I think we are adopting a very broad and comprehensive, inclusive concept of business, as well as the people who may be impacted, and the workers are part of the people who may be impacted. Thank you. Robert, over to you if there are any questions from the room. Otherwise, we can take questions from the chat as well.
A few more questions, Surya. So.
Thank you, Surya and Justine, once again. My concern is for, like somebody said earlier on, that majority of businesses are small and micro enterprises. And it might be very overwhelming for them to take on all human rights issue right from the onset. It's almost impossible for them to do that because there'd be cost to that, or there'd be the whole assessment process will take on cost and other aspects of it. Is there any particular issue you think there could be, then they can progressively look at other human rights issue, but are there some, like in Pacific, I think, particularly in Fiji, gender violence is an issue, violence against women is an issue. Are there some that they could start on before they start approaching the others? Or is it always encouraged for them to, focus on all of those aspects, which that might put them off completely from getting on board of going into implementing this process? Thank you.
I mean, the idea of, that's a great question. The idea of human rights due diligence is that it builds in some flexibility to basically identify those issues which are most pertinent or salient to the business. So what are the highest risks that the business might start to tackle with? Because it is a daunting task trying to do all of this at once. And much of that will also depend on the context. Certain sectors may have a greater risk to women than other sectors. Certain sectors may be more likely to be using children in the workforce. And so the idea is that the very first step for companies is to identify what those risks are. And there is the ability in the UNGPs to basically prioritize risk, much the way that states tackle human rights treaties. That if you look at the Treaty on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, there is this notion that some of those rights are absolutely fundamental to how it operates, and that's what states should start with, around access to food, access to water, access to housing and health. And so the same thing can work in this context. But that identification should be done in consultation with communities, with experts, with civil society. So it's not just the company determining how they might tackle that. Surya?
No, I think I will not add anything to that. So they have to pick on something, but my suggestion is that businesses cannot buy the respecting human rights from the shelf. You cannot go to supermarket as a company and buy the ready-made solution. Rather, companies have to engage the community and identify their priority areas and then work on them as part of a roadmap. Some issues they can address immediately, some issues they can address in the medium term and the long term. And the same applies to the governments. And I think we are happy to provide tailored guidance if needed. And of course, we are also willing to work with different stakeholders. Now we're running out of time. In fact, we have exceeded our time, and there is some interesting question in the chat box, which we may not have the time, unfortunately, to answer. But I very much hope that you will continue with this engagement throughout today as well as tomorrow. Right to food is also a human right. And I understand people virtually are joining from different parts of the world, but in Fiji, this is time for lunch, where the forum is taking place in person. So unless there is anything else, Justine, you want to say, I would thank everyone. And we will conclude this session. And after lunch break, there will be different parallel sessions. And please join and continue the conversation. We will email you all the material. And if you have any further questions, we will be trying to answer those through emails as well, if possible, later on. Thank you, everyone, from my side.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you very much to the UN office in Fiji and to all your really strong engagement in the room and online. And hopefully next year, we will see you all in Fiji in person or somewhere in the Pacific. Thank you, Robert and Hyun.
And once again, thank you very much to Robert and Hyun. Without two of you, we could not have pulled it together. Excellent so far. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.